won't you send me a break? Cause I need to get away, yeah.
Welcome to Living by My Name podcast. My name is Faith, and this is a space devoted to learning how to live by faith in our everyday lives. I'm so excited to be beginning this journey. So for today's first episode, I really want to talk about why I created this podcast, and also I want to go into depth about the name of this podcast because it is so much deeper than just the name. And I want to share with you guys how God gave me this name, how God gave me this revelation of doing this podcast. So God gave me the name for this podcast on November 9th, 2022. So a year ago, I was laying in my bed, I was trying to go to sleep, and God just kept giving me this vision of this podcast going through my mind, and I just kept trying to push it away, and I was trying to go to sleep, and I ended up not being able to fall asleep because this podcast idea just kept going through my mind over and over and over again. And I'm thinking to myself, like, no, me, Faith, doing a podcast, like, no, that sounds crazy. I will absolutely not be doing that. And so, as time went on, I just continued to keep trying to push that idea out of my head as far away as I possibly could, and it wouldn't go away. God did not allow the vision of this podcast to go away. It continued for months of me just not being able to get this podcast out of my head. So, and then God gave me the name Living by My Name podcast, and then that just kept going through my head over and over and over again. And so here we are a year later, and since then God has just been continuously showing me what it truly means to live by faith. This year has been one of the hardest years of my entire life. And while it has been one of the hardest years of my entire life, it's also been the year that I've grown the most spiritually. And so the reason that I know the exact date that God gave me this vision of the podcast was because that night that I couldn't sleep, the next morning I had sent a message to someone and explaining to them this vision that God had given me. And so I have the text message that I sent on November 9th, 2022. And here I am in November 2023 making my very first podcast, and I'm so excited. And so I really want to talk about what living by faith and walking by faith truly means. And faith is so vital in the Christian walk that it says that without faith, it is impossible to please God. And so there's two scriptures that I want to reference throughout the entirety of this podcast. The first one is Galatians 2:20. And it says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. The second verse that I always want us to go back to is 2 Corinthians 5:7. And this is a verse that God gave me confirmation on when I was thinking about the podcast, when I was preparing for the podcast. This is a verse that I really want to be like the theme verse of the podcast. So 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, for we walk by faith and not by sight. And that's what I want us to always go back to. No matter what topic we talk about on this podcast, it can always go back to this verse. And that's what I really want to dive deep into today, is walking by faith and not by sight. And so I really want to share with you guys how God gave me confirmation on this verse. And it is amazing how God works. So as I'm preparing for this podcast, I'm praying to God. I'm like, God, show me what you want me to talk about for my first podcast. Like, I have no idea how I'm going to start this. Like, I just was asking for guidance. So an incident happened before I read the study notes in my study Bible for this verse. And so I want to read to y'all what the study notes said for this verse. So in the beginning of the 5th chapter, Paul talks about death and eternity with Christ. And so in the study notes for this verse in my study Bible, it says, Paul was not afraid to die because he was confident of spending eternity with Christ. Then it says, of course, facing the unknown may cause us some anxiety, but if we believe in Jesus, we can share Paul's hope. So I really want y'all to keep that in mind as I tell y'all this confirmation that God gave me. So I work at a hospital, and I was taking one of my patients to surgery, and she's the sweetest lady ever. We were having a great conversation on the way there, and on the way to surgery, she looks at me and she says, I might not make it out of this. They told me that I might not come back. But she said, I'm at peace with that because I'm right with God. And that's the first thing that my study notes said. It said Paul was not afraid to die because he was confident in spending eternity with Christ. And then so we continue to get to surgery. We enter the pre-op room. I'm setting everything up. And she looks at me and she says, I'm experiencing some anxiety. And so I show her my name badge, and of course my name badge says Faith. So I show it to her and I say, you have to have what? And she says, Faith. And she smiles and she says, I do have it. And then before I left, she grabbed my hand and she looked at me and she told me that she loved me. And I told her that I love her too. And you could tell, you could feel the love of God through that entire interaction, because when you can meet somebody and within 20 minutes of your interaction you guys can tell each other that you love each other without it being uncomfortable or awkward or weird, that's how you know it's the love of God. And I just felt the love of God through the entire interaction that me and this lady had. And praise God, she did make it out of the surgery. I went to go check on her later and she told me how sweet I was. But I said all that to say that the second part of the study notes said that facing the unknown may cause some anxiety, but if we believe in Jesus, we can share Paul's hope. And the whole interaction with the lady happened before I read the study notes for this verse, and that happened later on that day. So when I read the study notes, it felt like confirmation from God, because this interaction that happened with the lady was identical to what the study notes was saying. Walking by faith means fixing our eyes on what is eternal. And so 2 Corinthians 4:18 says, so if we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary and what is unseen is eternal. And so think about when Moses and the Israelites reached the Red Sea. What if Moses had taken one look at this huge ocean in front of him and this humongous army chasing him behind him and allowed what he saw to determine his circumstance? Our physical sight can sometimes act as a spiritual blindness. What we see is what we allow to determine our circumstance. And to walk by faith is the exact opposite of that. To walk by faith, we have to refocus our sight. What if walking by faith and not by sight is just simply redirecting our sight? Because essentially that's what you're doing. You're focusing on what is eternal instead of what is temporary. And so now your focus isn't on the impossible, but it's on the one who can do the impossible. So like Abraham and Sarah, they saw their circumstance was they were old and they haven't had children yet. But when they took their eyes off the circumstance and they redirected their vision to the one who's in control of the situation, he said, you will bear a son. He promised them that they will bear a son. But if they kept their eyes focused on the circumstance that they were old, they wouldn't be walking by faith. Walking by faith means that they would have to focus on the one who said they would bear a son. And there's so many examples in the Bible of where if a person or people focused on their circumstances instead of God, it could have turned out completely different. Because when we walk by faith and not by sight, we are not focusing on what is happening in our lives. We're not focusing on this hardship we're going through right now. We're not focusing on this relationship. We're not focusing on our finances. We're not focusing on that situation, but we're focusing on the one who controls that situation. And so it changes the perspective. And walking by faith and not by sight is something that we have to do every single day. We have to put into practice every single day, because there's going to come circumstances every single day where we're going to have to look to God and not look at the circumstance. And so as we dig deep into this podcast, we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to be transparent. We're going to dig deep into the struggles and the challenges that we face as young adult believers. And it's all going to always revert back to walking by faith and not by sight, because essentially everything that we go through, we're always going to have to continue to learn how to walk by faith and not by sight. So I'm really excited to dig deeper into what God has for this podcast. He's given me so many topics and things that I want to discuss with you all. And also, if you have anything that you really want me to talk about in the future, please DM the podcast Instagram. It'll be linked in the description. You can just send me things that you may want me to talk about, or if you have a question about something, let me know, because I will do a Q&A video at some point. So if you send me a question, I'll save it for that video. And I want to make note that it's not always easy to walk by faith and not by sight. It's by no means ever going to be just such an easy thing to do. But the things that happen on this earth, the things that we can see, is all under God's control. So it's essential for us to look to Him about our circumstances instead of looking at what we're going through. And I know that's a lot easier said than done, because it's something that I struggle with on a daily basis. I'm looking at this hardship that I'm going through right now, and as I said in the beginning, this has been the hardest year of my life, and it's taught me that I can't control what happens down here. As much as I may try sometimes to be in control, as much as sometimes I try to take matters into my own hands, but there's only one person that can control what happens down here, and that is Him, and that is our Father in heaven. He's taught me so much about faith in the last year to 2 years, and He put me in a position where I lost a lot, and I had no choice but to have faith in Him. And sometimes we wonder why God allows us to go through certain things, and why He allows certain things to happen to us. And I was in that position at the beginning of this year, just questioning, like, God, why would you allow this to happen to me? I learned over the past year to stop asking God why and thanking Him instead, because the Bible also says that the testing of our faith produces steadfastness. And sometimes God allows things to happen to test our faith. Like, how much faith do we really have in Him? And that doesn't come to play until something happens where our faith can be tested. Because when everything is going good, obviously we're going to have faith in God because everything's going good. But when our life turns upside down, do we still have that same faith when everything was good? And so that's why sometimes God allows things to happen to test our faiths. Look at Job in the Bible. Like, everything that he had, everything that he loved, everything was taken away from him, but he still had faith in God through all that. He never cursed God. He never said anything bad about God. He still had faith, and it proved that the same faith that he had when he had everything is the same faith that he had when everything was gone. We have to realize that when we're going through things, God wants nothing but the best for us. He loves us. We're His children. So of course He doesn't want bad things to happen to us. But at the same time, sometimes He has to allow things to happen so that we can trust Him. And I'm very thankful that I have had to go through what I've gone through this past year, and I'm still continuing to go through. But it has helped me to become more spiritually mature. It has helped me to grow. I'm very, very thankful that I've gone through what I've had to go through, because now I'm in a position where I trust God more than I ever have in my entire life. And so as you carry on throughout this next week, I really want you to focus on redirecting your vision on God and not the circumstances. And so whenever something happens throughout your day or throughout your week, I really want you to focus on redirecting your vision to the one who controls that situation, that circumstance that you may be going through, struggling with, whatever. So I really want to challenge you guys to do that throughout this week. But I really thank you guys for joining me, coming along this journey with me. I'm super excited. It's going to be a wonderful, wonderful ride. So buckle up. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be spirit-filled. It's going to be, I know that God has His hand in the midst. And when God has His hand in the midst, there is going to be an overflow of blessings in it. And I am just so grateful and thankful that God is just continuing to use me in every way possible. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for joining me, and I will see you on the next one.
Dear God, won't you send me a break? 'Cause I need to get away.